What do you think the most watched drone footage looks like? Is it a military strike? Is it an Amazon package descending from a hexacopter onto some porch in the American suburbs? Or is it a synchronized light show over a stadium, hundreds if not thousands of drones forming a, let's say, company logo against the night sky? Or maybe it's first-person view camera strapped to a racing drone, threading impossible gaps at 60 miles per hour. There are examples of all this footage with millions of views, and all of it shapes how people think about what drones are and what they're for. So let me describe the drone I want to talk about today. It is a DJI Mini 4 Pro. It weighs 249 grams, not a coincidence. 249 grams is 1 gram under the FAA's registration threshold, which means it doesn't appear in a lot of official statistics about American drone use. According to FAA-funded research using remote ID telemetry dating from 2025, the Mini 4 Pro is the single most common drone in US airspace. It accounts for roughly 1/5, 19% of all detected platforms. And yet, the regulatory definition of the US drone fleet barely counts it. This drone takes off from a park, climbs to about 80 meters, that's 260 feet for our American listeners, above ground level, and then flies a pre-programmed grid pattern for about 7, sometimes 9 minutes if it's windy. Takes a bunch of photos. It lands. The pilot uploads the data, they move on to the next hexagon and repeat. Nobody's filming this, nobody's watching this, nobody's hearing this. The drone is essentially invisible at that altitude. The pilot, who might be a retired engineer, a part-time photography enthusiast, someone who just likes being outside, will do this a few times this week. And every time they upload that data and it's successfully verified, they get paid. It's possible you've never thought about it, let alone seen it. The drone, the person doing these missions, the network these missions are all contributing to, but I would argue that DJI Mini 4 Pro specifically, but this class of drone broadly, is arguably the most important, the most overlooked drone in the sky right now. And the fact that it's overlooked, the fact that it can be overlooked, is precisely why it's doing the most consequential drone work in the world today. Welcome to the Drone Network, the only podcast in the air and on the airwaves. I am your host, Bryce Bladed, and on this show, we document the tech, economics, and people piloting the world's largest standardized drone imagery network. Each episode, we explore how drones are reshaping industries, creating new economic opportunities, and literally changing how we see the world. On today's episode, the drone you'll never see, and why invisibility is its key to success. All right, so to start us off, let's talk about what we, the collective we, think drones are actually for. Because to be perfectly honest with you, when I started this podcast about a year ago, I didn't really understand what drones were for. Or rather, I only understood a very, very small sliver of how drones were used. My experience 18 years ago was largely in film, and most of my experience and understanding of drones was kind of driven by that application of them, photography, videography, and leveraging them that way. And then there were the other obvious categories, military UAVs. That's probably the context most people have when the word drone entered mainstream vocabulary in the early 2010s. Delivery has been something that's been talked about for a very long time. I'm not sure it's something that's necessarily seen very often, but it really does still command a bit of hype. And then there's what I was mentioning before, stuff like aerial photography and, less thought of stuff even, like weddings and real estate listings and things of that effect. And even the sweeping landscape shots that are arguably cliches now in everything from Hollywood films to adventure documentaries. But none of those framings actually prepare me for what the industry actually looks like when you look at where it is and where, to put it simply, the money is. My recent conversation with Dylan Gorman was a good reminder that a successful drone operator doesn't sell their craft as a drone operator. They sell the clever ways a drone can solve a customer's problem. Dylan defined it as a solutions engineer, and that, in my mind, is really anyone who's working with new technology in a way to make a good business or money from it. I'm not selling blockchain, I'm not selling AI, I'm not selling drones, I'm not selling XYZ. What you should be selling is how they can actually fix a painful problem for someone. So, the global drone market is, depending on who you ask and what you include, somewhere in the range of 50 to 85 billion as of 2025. Those numbers vary because different research firms count different things: military versus commercial, hardware versus services, OEM versus aftermarket. But every major analysis agrees on this one structural fact. The commercial segment is the fastest growing part of the market and is dominated not by cameras and light shows, but by data collection. Mapping and surveying, infrastructure inspection, agriculture, insurance assessment, environmental monitoring, construction monitoring, utility corridor management, telecom tower inspection. Candidly, these are all things I am now aware drones do, but I wasn't really aware a year ago. I only, again, knew the sliver of these things, what I thought were edge cases. I had no idea drones in agriculture had come as far as they have. According to Drone Industry Insights, the most common commercial drone applications globally are, in order, mapping and surveying first, then inspection, then photography and filming. The most visually arresting use case, the one that gets the YouTube views, is third on that list of what the industry actually does. The energy sector alone, utilities, oil and gas, renewables, has the greatest variety of drone use cases is any industry vertical. But let's talk about what that means. Companies inspecting power lines, surveying pipelines, monitoring wind turbines, and checking solar farms are spending more on drone services than any other sector. None of that makes an exciting video, but it keeps the videos on. According to industry data, 92% of US utility companies now use drones for infrastructure inspection. It's 9 out of 10, and drone-based power grid maintenance has been linked to reducing about a fifth of power outages, 18% specifically. There's a fundamental improvement in the reliability of the infrastructure that everything else runs on. And this, to my mind, is not to my mind, by definition, this is more than a marginal improvement. Meanwhile, 68% of U.S. construction firms use drones for aerial imaging and surveying. The drone mapping market in the U.S. grew at a 22% compound annual growth rate from 2018 to 2023, and it's still accelerating. And there is a reason. A study published by the American Society for Civil Engineers found that drone-based road condition monitoring can generate a return on investment of up to 980%. I really want to be clear, that is not 98%, that is 980%, and that number sounds absurd. What it means is for every dollar spent on drone-based road monitoring, researchers found operators were getting back up to $10, partly because the drone is cheap, but mostly because catching a small problem earlier is orders of magnitude less expensive than fixing a big one later. Drones don't just reduce inspection costs, they shift the entire economics of infrastructure maintenance. The catch here being that it's harder to see when something solves the problem years in advance versus seeing the horrible problem happen, the worst case scenario, and then needing to fix it. It's why you don't see drones doing this necessarily, even though what they are doing is one of the most impactful applications of drones. Traditional infrastructure surveys require crews. They require equipment, lane closures, scaffolding, sometimes rappelling equipment for vertical structures. A drone can cover a lot of that same ground in a fraction of the time at a fraction of the cost without putting people in a dangerous situation and possibly without ever slowing down the infrastructure it's monitoring. And it's not just that the inspection is cheap. It's that cheap inspections prevent expensive repairs. Again, that invisible layer of it all. On road infrastructure, a crack is just exponentially cheaper to fix sooner than later. These industries don't think of themselves as drone industries. They think of themselves as energy companies and construction firms and insurance carriers. And drones are just the tool that solved a problem they've had for decades. Benji Navat, who spent a decade as a drone operator for the police before starting his own drone business, made an observation in his episode that I was thinking about with this. He mentioned that when flying missions with the Spexy app on the Lair drone network, the small DJI Mini 234 he uses is basically undetectable at altitude. Nobody looks up. Nobody notices. Compare that to his early experience with an Inspire 2, which is essentially an unmanned helicopter. It's loud, it's extremely visible, it draws attention wherever it flies. The transition to consumer scale micro drones didn't just change the cost structure of drone work, it changed the social dynamic. It changed, in my mind, the culture. When Benji flew that Inspire 2, people noticed. They stopped what they were doing, they took out their phones, they asked questions, maybe they complained. Attention creates friction, operational friction, regulatory friction, community friction. A drone that draws a crowd is a drone that's creating problems for itself. If I was to take this to another episode, something I said about drone infrastructure is part of what makes it work is what makes good plumbing work. You don't see it, you don't hear it. Your pipes start banging, your drone starts roaring, you do notice it, and you think something's wrong. A drone that nobody notices is a drone that can operate in places and for purposes that a more conspicuous drone can't. I'm not talking about doing things covertly, to be clear, but doing things, for lack of a better way of putting it, politely, considerately. Everything on the Lair drone network is operating legally, regulatorily, at standardized altitudes, proper airspace authorizations through the FAA's LAA NC system, but unobtrusively, without the friction of public attention. The invisibility here is a feature, not a bug. The most important infrastructure tends to be invisible. You don't think about the pipes when you turn on the tap. You don't think about cell towers when you make a call. The electrical grid doesn't come to mind when the lights are on. Infrastructure that works correctly disappears from your perception. The boring drone doing grid passes over a suburb is infrastructure that's working correctly. We talked a bit about preconceptions for what drones are and why those drones we don't see are actually the dominant use cases. So let's talk about those drones at scale. Let's talk about the invisible fleet. And let's start by describing the Lair drone network. I talk about it quite a bit, obviously. This is a podcast about the world's largest standardized drone imagery network, and that is Lair drone. That is the world's first autonomous aerial data network. And I think even some of the people I know who work on it, obviously that includes thousands of pilots in the Lair drone Discord who are actively contributing to it. I don't think they've fully visualized it. I don't think even some of the people who work at Spexy necessarily understand all of its applications. It is 6.5 million acres mapped via roughly 220,000 missions via thousands of registered pilots on the network. And this is just North America right now, primarily concentrated in urban corridors, spreading into smaller cities and suburbs as hexagon and demand drives coverage. Graham Anderson, who manages Spexy's pilot operations, described the pilots building this network as surprisingly similar despite being extremely diverse. What he meant by this? Different ages, different backgrounds, different geographic locations. I recently asked the 12,000 plus people in the Lair drone Discord who their inspiration for flying was. Their responses were as varied as the pilots themselves. YouTubers, WW2 bomber pilots, other pilots using the Spexy app, husbands, partners, Sully Sullenberger, the list goes on. But there is something consistent about the pilots themselves, an enthusiasm for the technology, a comfort with being an early adopter, a tendency toward the kind of precision and reliability that flying requires. 3 buckets, roughly speaking, tend to define the thousands of drone pilots building the Lair drone network. Aviation people, the obvious one who came into drones from an existing interest in flight. Some of them retired pilots, some of them former RC hobbyists, some of them military or first responder backgrounds. We got a lot of creative folks who got into drones through photography or videography and found the data collection use case part of it interesting and different from what they expected. I think mostly because most of us don't think of ourselves as collecting data when we're flying our drones. And then there's the tech curious people who are drawn to the systems, the GPS, the autonomous flight planning, the data pipeline, the network leaderboard I publish every week. 3 types of people, all very different, and all of them, for the most part, for a few hours on a given week, are part of the infrastructure. They go to a location, they launch a drone, they monitor it as it flies an automated grid pattern, checking for unexpected airspace conflicts, obstacle hazards, terrain variance as the drone flies. The pilot's job in this context is to be the responsible human in the loop. The compliance layer, the 7-minute safety margin for the flying robot. They are the responsible operator who makes it legally and practically viable to collect data at this scale. They don't necessarily know how that data is coordinated, processed, or used. They don't even necessarily know how missions are brought to Spexy by clients, defined by regulations, or launched by Spexy onto the Lair drone network. But honestly, they don't have to. It's those pilots who are building the world's largest drone network, 7-minute mission by 7-minute mission. AA data shows that the average drone pilot in the US tends to skew male, tends to be in their 40s or 50s. It's roughly consistent with what I see in the community, but again, very, very wide range. A lot of pilots who are 65 and retired, flying a few days a week to do something. We have pilots in their mid-20s who treat the leaderboard like a real competition sport. And we have some part-time photographers who picked up their Part 107 license in the US because they wanted to make their aerial work more legible to commercial clients. What these people have in common isn't the demographic profile, it's disposition. They're comfortable operating technology with care and precision. And I do wonder if some part of it is they are operating drones that don't necessarily draw attention. What these people have in common isn't a demographic profile, it's a disposition. They're comfortable operating technology with care and precision, they can follow a procedure without someone looking over their shoulder, and they're early adopters who are willing to be a part of something that isn't quite finished yet. And that last quality, the willingness to operate in an unfinished system, is more important than it might sound. The Lair drone network is growing, which means the product experience is still being refined, the Spexy app as it were. And as coverage is still expanding, mission types are evolving. I said pilots are actively building this network, and they are, but they are also actively defining it in many ways. We've experimented with pilots determining where missions launch, and the network is experimenting with other ways to compensate them. What are the motivations? How do we make sure that, areas with a lot of pilots are fairly rewarded and areas without many pilots can still get people out there somehow? It's to be seen. But as we go on, the pilots who stick with it are the ones that find these changes, these evolutions, and the growth that's coming with it exciting rather than frustrating. They're, to put it simply, not waiting for the thing to be polished, they're helping to polish it. I want to linger on somebody who's been on the show here, Daniel Whitfield, for a moment. His arc is pretty interesting. He was a drone first responder, probably still is. On the days he flies in that capacity, he's sitting on a rooftop with a drone on standby, ready to launch in seconds of an emergency call. Stream live footage to officers on the ground before they arrive at the scene. He's there to give responders eyes on a situation before anyone is in physical danger. And that is, objectively, a more dramatic application of drones than, say, grid mapping a suburb. And yet, Daniel's relationship to the Spexy app, flying standardized missions for the Lair drone network, earning bi-weekly payouts on the same cadence as his regular job, that's what he credits for developing the disciplined, precise flying style that makes him good at his first responder role. That boring work made him better at the dramatic work. And I do wonder, again, to talk about the invisible things here, how many people know he had that and still has that side job? First responder drone work is high stakes. It's time compressed, it's stressful. The last thing you want in that moment is to be thinking about stick discipline or altitude management or how to handle an LAANC conflict. Those things should be automatic. They should become automatic through repetition, through doing the exact same thing correctly dozens and then hundreds of times, and ideally, at least for the first few hundred times, not when lives are on the line. The standardized mission is, in a sense, the practice, the reps. The grid flying that nobody films is building the muscle memory that allows Daniel to operate in other situations. This is something I've noticed across a lot of the pilots in this community. The competitive aspect of chasing leaderboards, optimizing mission sequences, figuring out how to get the most missions out of a single battery charge. It also builds a technical fluency. And also, despite this competition, these pilots are willing to share in both the glamorous and unglamorous parts of their job and the tips that come with it. So let's pull back a bit and talk about the data these invisible pilots are generating with their invisible drones. Because I think it's easy to think of the missions as the product, particularly when you're a pilot and you are getting paid for every one of those. They're not the product, at least not for anyone except for pilots themselves. The missions are how the product gets made. The product is the imagery, and specifically the imagery dataset at scale. So here's the problem that the imagery dataset is solving. Most aerial imagery of the world, the kind you see on Google Maps, in ArcGIS, in any planning tool, it's updated on cycles of months to years. Esri's own documentation notes that high-resolution imagery for most of the world is typically within 3 to 5 years of current. 3 to 5 years. A neighborhood could build a dozen new houses in that time. A commercial district can be completely redeveloped. A flood can change an entire riverbank. And the map will show what things still looked like half a decade ago. Satellites are getting better. Maxar is currently developing a constellation of Worldview Legion satellites that will more than than triple their imaging capacity for high resolution stuff, but satellites have limits that are fundamental to what they are. They can't fly low, they can't fly on demand, they can't thread through cloud cover or capture sub-meter detail at the ground level. That drone imagery can. The imagery drones produce is already exponentially more detailed than satellite imagery, and it's improving at least as fast. And rolling out those improvements doesn't, relatively speaking, require rocket science. What the Lair drone network is building is not a competitor to satellite imagery, though. It's a layer that can go beneath it. Fresher, higher resolution, repeatable, built by the people who live and work in the areas being mapped. To be perfectly honest, a full map of the Earth captured by satellites and aircraft is a great foundation to start from. It is exactly what I imagine when I say the Lair drone network is upgrading the world map. But that foundation, just using satellite imagery, it would be insufficient for training AI on spatial awareness, getting updates as quickly as needed, and doing any of this at the fraction of the cost of, again, a satellite. Not a cheap thing. An interesting challenge for Lair drone is that the people creating the spatial intelligence for the city are, in many cases, the residents of that city. Some of the pilots travel when they can justify it, but it can be hard to find pilots in remote areas. But what that also means is that these drone pilots tend to care about what they're doing and how it affects others. The pilot who maps the suburb lives in that suburb. They know when there's construction, they know when the park just got redone, and they have a stake in the accuracy of this map. And also, they probably don't want the sound of a helicopter taking off every time they use their drone down the street, but we'll come back to that. I've covered a lot of surprising or interesting drone stories on this show. The vineyard in Burgundy, the Everest cleanup project using heavy lift drones, and Kosovo planting 10,000 trees a day in terrain too rugged for human crews. None of those stories have the same structural feature as suburb mapping or anything else we're talking about here. None of them are dramatic in the cinematic sense. Nobody is watching them with 10 million views on YouTube. I mean, one of them would literally be watching trees grow. But they're doing things that could not be done before at this cost, at the scale, with this regularity, and that is quietly changing something. The pattern I keep seeing is drones showing up not because someone decided to use more technology, but because there was a problem that existing tools couldn't solve cleanly. Vines you can't see are sick. Trash in terrain humans can't access. Trees that need planting in places planting crews can't reach. A world map that needs to be updated continuously at a scale and cost that satellites and manned aircraft can't match. In every case, the drone fills a gap and builds a bridge. And it does so quietly. It goes somewhere people can't or shouldn't or can't afford to go. And in many cases, the drone doing that work looks about as glamorous as a lawnmower. But when it's not as loud or as abrasive as one, it can do a lot more without disturbing the environment and that environment's neighbors. Like good plumbing. I think good drone infrastructure is most promising if it's rarely seen, almost never heard, and used by the people who live with it. Good infrastructure is usually invisible. It's the crashes, the screech of brakes, the blinking red eyes of a light-turned four-way stop that remind you that it's there. And there's a thing that happens to technology when it matures. It stops being interesting. Electricity was genuinely remarkable once. So was running water in a house. The refrigerator, the automobile, the telephone, the microwave, all of these were, at some point, objects of wonder, subjects of magazine articles and World's Fair exhibitions and public amazement. People would gather to watch demonstrations. They debated what these technologies would mean for society. Speaking of electricity, Thomas Edison's company once electrocuted an elephant, and another one of Thomas Edison's companies filmed it to prove their points about electricity. It was a weird time. But now these things, they're all infrastructure. You don't think about them unless they fail. The absence is noticeable, but the presence is invisible. When it's not there, it becomes a sort of elephant in the room. That little Edison story really came back for me. Drones are going through multiple versions of this transition simultaneously and at different speeds in different sectors. In agriculture, the transition is pretty advanced right now. Professional pilots fly commercial sprayers, and mapping sensors are just a part of how large farms operate now. But in construction, drones are still novel enough to generate internal presentations, but they are common enough that most large-level construction firms have a standard drone workflow. In consumer entertainment and racing, the wonder phase is still very much alive. But the standardized imagery use case, the quiet grid passes over cities and suburbs that the Lair drone network is built around, I think we're still somewhere in the early infrastructure phase. The pilots who have been doing it for 2 years don't think of themselves as doing something remarkable anymore. It's just something they do on, say, Tuesday morning. The map updates, the payout hits, they go to the next spexagon. That normalization is actually the goal, not just because it means adoption is happening, but because infrastructure that functions quietly is infrastructure that's functioning. I want to close with a question that I've been forming since I started doing this show. Why does it matter that we can see the world more accurately? Maps are not neutral. Maps encode decision about what's worth measuring, what's worth updating, what level of accuracy is good enough. And for most of human history, accurate spatial data was scarce, expensive, and concentrated in the hands of governments and large institutions that could afford to produce it. So what changes when accurate spatial data becomes abundant, affordable, and distributed? When the people doing the mapping are the same people who live in the mapped places and have perhaps some sort of stake in the network itself? Some of the answers are obvious. You get better planning. You get more accurate insurance assessments. You get more reliable infrastructure management, faster disaster response, because you have baseline data to compare when something changes. But some of the answers are harder to see. Democratic access to spatial knowledge has historically been a meaningful factor in who gets to make decisions about land use, development, and infrastructure investment. When the data about a neighborhood is controlled by entities external to that neighborhood, those entities have a disproportionate power over decisions that affect the people who live there. Now, I'm not saying this Lair drone network is going to solve political economy. I am saying that a distributed network of local pilots generating high-resolution, frequently updated spatial data is structurally different from a centralized satellite imagery contract, and that structural difference has implications we can't fully see yet. It's invisible, and that's true of most important infrastructure. You can't always see what it enables until it's been running long enough to change the conditions around it. I've been thinking about something Mason Paul said to me during a conversation. He was talking about the gap between what clients ask for and what they realize they needed once they have the data. A client commissions mapping for a specific project, a development site, a municipal planning process, a corridor study, a lot of different things. They get the data they asked for, and then they start asking questions they didn't know they had. What changed here since last year? How does this block compare to the one adjacent to it? What does this area look like in winter versus summer? Can we track this over time? And that's the moment where the data set stops being a deliverable and starts being infrastructure. Once you have it, once you have the start of that data, once you trust it, once you can build workflows around it, you start depending on its continuity. You need it to be there next month and the month after, not just for this project. And it needs to be updated too. It needs that temporal layer, time, that's been missing from most modern maps. And that's what the boring drone is building. It's one hexagon at a time, about 25 acres a hexagon. It's not a product. It's an expectation of accuracy, a dependency on a kind of knowledge that didn't reliably exist before, maybe even couldn't reliably exist before. So next time you take a look at a map and trust it, think there might be a drone somewhere out there working to make sure you can. I've been Bryce Bladen. This is the Drone Network. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being a part of the Drone Network. Subscribe wherever fine podcasts are served to get a new episode every week. And remember to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. It helps a lot. Today's show was sponsored by Spexy Geospatial and Lair Drone. Learn more about standardized drone imagery built for global scale at spexy.com, that's spexi.com, and lairdrone.org. Thanks again for listening.